Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to dispense the quorum call.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to honor the memory of Jesse Owens, an Olympic record breaker and pioneer on the track and off the track, who was born 100 years ago tomorrow. Born in Alabama as the youngest of 10 children, James Cleveland Owens moved to Cleveland, Ohio with his family at the age of 9. Leaving the South during the Great Migration, those several decades between 1910 roughly and 1970, Jesse's family came north seeking economic opportunity and greater personal freedom. His father left his work as a sharecropper in the South, something difficult to do because so often the landowner held those sharecroppers by holding real or imagined debt over their heads. He left his work as a sharecropper in the South and found a job in the steel industry in Cleveland, Ohio. James Cleveland Owens enrolled in Bolton Elementary School on the east side of Cleveland. Because of his strong Southern accent, when the teacher asked him his name and he said J.C., the teacher misheard it and started calling him Jesse, a name that stuck. While in junior high, he met Charles Riley, who taught him about physical education and coached the track team. Charles Riley nurtured Jesse's obvious talent, helping him to grow stronger athletically and set long-term goals that served him well as he went on to Cleveland East Technical School. My hometown of Mansfield, Ohio, started hosting the storied Mansfield Relays, one of the biggest relays, maybe the biggest in the country, beginning in 1927, a sporting event that drew athletes from 6 states and Canada. I remember my family in the 1960s hosting many of the visiting athletes that came to our town to compete in the Mansfield Relays. Among these many promising athletes, obviously prior to my parents doing that, none shine brighter than the sprinter from just an hour up north. At the Mansfield Relays, Jesse Owens sharpened his focus and won the 32 and 33 relays for East Tech, setting records that lasted into my childhood, into the 1960s and 70s. He later went on to attend The Ohio State University, where he's known as the Buckeye Bullet, winning a record 8 individual NCAA championships. The story goes that at Ann Arbor, at the Big Ten track meet one year in Ann Arbor, Michigan, while competing in a 45-minute period, Jesse Owens set 3 world records. We're used to seeing college athletes that are revered today, but in his day, Owens could not live on campus due to a lack of housing for black students. He could not stay at the same hotels when his track team traveled or eat at the same restaurants as the white players on that team while they were traveling with him. But he achieved global fame and heroism status because of what he did during the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. While a hateful regime in Germany hoped to use the Olympics to promote the Aryan race, to promulgate a wrong-headed, dangerous, and inherently racist belief in the superiority of that race, Jesse Owens turned this theory on its head. He won 4 gold medals in Berlin. He set world records in 3 events while tying for a world record in a 4th event. He showed that talent and sportsmanship transcended race. And he embarrassed an evil dictator who hoped to manipulate the Olympic Games to further his political agenda. Interestingly, Adolf Hitler refused to shake hands with Jesse Owens when he won one of those events. The International Olympic Committee told the German government that Hitler either shake hands with all the winners or none of the winners, and Hitler, the story goes, Hitler refused to come back and observe the Olympics. Again, a testament to the heroism and the courage and the discipline of James Cleveland, Jesse Owens. Despite these achievements, in the Rose Garden and Oval Office greetings that today's Olympians are accustomed to, Jesse Owens never received congratulations or recognition by President Truman, President Roosevelt, or President Truman. It was only during the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower that in a different time, beginning to be a different time in race relations in this country, that a president of the United States actually recognized Jesse Owens' achievement. He was by most measurements the best athlete in the world, but he returned to the United States of America, a black man in the 1930s, to face economic challenges and racial discrimination that are far too familiar to far too many Americans. He continued to travel and inspire athletes and fans across the globe. I had the honor of meeting Jesse Owens when I was 12 years old, when he was the speaker at my brother Bob's high school graduation in 1965. Jesse Owens worked alongside the State Department to promote goodwill in Asia and worked in 1950 to promote democracy abroad as part of a Cold War effort. Think about that. A black man who is the best athlete in the world was a hero to large numbers of Americans, black and white, in 1936, standing up in many ways against the fascist machine of Adolf Hitler, not being recognized by a president of the United States who was winning a war against Hitler ultimately, yet he went out 5 years later after that war to promote democracy abroad as part of a Cold War effort. Still proud of his country, still knowing our country had work to do. 1973, he was appointed to the board of directors of the U.S. Olympic Committee, where he worked to ensure the best training and conditions for U.S. athletes. He lent his skill and his talents to various charitable groups, notably the Boys Club of America. In 1976, Jesse Owens finally received the presidential recognition that he's deserved, was presented with the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Ford. Jesse Owens was a pioneer. Despite facing adversity, he had the strength of mind and the discipline common to almost all great athletes to become the most elite of athletes. Despite being treated differently and shamefully from other athletes of his stature, he went on to shatter records. Despite competing in the darkest of days globally, he did his part, standing up to fascism, dispelling racism, and promoting unity. Tomorrow, Mr. President, we celebrate the 100th birthday of a hero to all Americans, James Cleveland Jesse Owens. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from New Hampshire.
I ask the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business until 7 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you. I ask that the quorum call be resumed.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to proceed in morning business.
Senator, we're in a quorum call.
Thank you. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to proceed as if in morning business for up to 25 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the decision on whether or not to authorize the President of the United States to use the military might of our great nation against another country is the most significant vote that a senator can cast. The Constitution vests this responsibility in Congress, a duty that rests heavily on the shoulders of each and every member. We are now engaged in a serious debate about what the appropriate response should be to the horrific use of chemical weapons by the regime of Syrian President Assad, who killed his own people using chemical weapons on August 21st. This was not the first use of chemical weapons by President Assad. He launched several smaller-scale attacks, murdering his citizens, and notably, many, if not all of those attacks occurred after the President drew his red line a year ago. But it was not until the large-scale August 21st attack of this year, which resulted in the deaths of approximately 1,400 people, that President Obama decided that a military strike against Syria was warranted. The fact is, Assad violated the International Convention prohibiting the use of chemical weapons and crossed President Obama's red line many times during the past year. Deciding whether or not to grant the President this authority is a very difficult decision. I have participated in numerous discussions with the President, the Vice President, and experts in and out of government. I've attended many classified briefings as a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and I have carefully weighed the assessments of the intelligence community and military and State Department officials. My constituents have also provided me with valuable insights that have helped to guide my decision. After much deliberation and thought, I have decided that I cannot support the resolution that was approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. Mr. President, one of the criteria for the use of military force is surely whether or not the adversary poses an imminent threat to the American people. More than once, President Obama has stated that Syria's chemical weapons and delivery systems do not pose a direct imminent threat to the United States. Neither the United States nor any of our allies have been attacked with chemical weapons. Instead, President Obama justifies the attack that he is proposing as a response to the violation of international norms, despite the fact that we currently lack international partners to enforce the Convention on Chemical Weapons through military means. Mr. President, although the term limited airstrikes sounds less threatening, the fact is even limited airstrikes constitute an act of war. If bombs were dropped from the air or cruise missiles were launched into an American city, we would certainly consider that to be an act of war. And that is why this decision is fraught with consequences. American military strikes against the Assad regime, in my judgment, risk entangling the United States in the middle of a protracted, dangerous, and ugly civil war. General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has warned us that the use of U.S. military force, quote, cannot resolve the underlying and historic ethnic, religious, and tribal issues that are fueling this conflict, end quote. The introduction of American armed forces into this violent conflict could escalate to the point where we are perceived to be or actually are involved in a Syrian civil war or a proxy war with Hezbollah or Iran. In this complex conflict, it is also becoming increasingly difficult to sort out the good guys from the bad. There is no doubt that Assad is a brutal, ruthless dictator who murders his own citizens and who is supported by thousands of Hezbollah terrorist fighters. The opposition, however, is not pure. It has now been infiltrated by not one, but two affiliates of al-Qaeda, as well as by criminal gangs. Caught in the middle are millions of Syrians who simply want to lead peaceful lives. The tragic result has been more than 100,000 people killed, 4 million displaced internally, and 2 million refugees. We do not know how Assad or his allies would respond to a U.S. military attack. But an asymmetric attack by Hezbollah aimed at one of our embassies or at other American interests abroad certainly is one potential response. My concern is that reprisals followed by subsequent retaliations, followed by still more reprisals, could lead to an escalation of violence that never was intended by the President, but which may well be the result of the first strike. I have raised this issue directly with administration officials since the one-and-done strike, as retired General Michael Hayden puts it, may well not work. I asked the administration, what would they do if Assad waits until the 91st day when the authorization for the use of military force expires and then conducts an attack using chemical weapons that kills a much smaller number of people? What will we do then? In each case where I've raised this question, I have been told that we would likely launch another military strike. In addition to my concern about being dragged into the Syrian civil war, I question whether the proposed military response would be more effective in achieving the goal of eliminating Assad's stockpile of chemical weapons than a diplomatic approach would be. Let us be clear. The strikes proposed by the President would not eliminate Assad's chemical weapons nor his means of delivering them. In the President's own words, the purpose of these strikes is to degrade Assad's capabilities to deliver chemical weapons. Indeed, Mr. President, you will not find any military or intelligence official who believes that the strike contemplated by the administration would eliminate Syria's chemical weapons stockpile or all of the delivery systems. General Dempsey wrote to Armed Services Committee Chairman Carl Levin that even if an explicit military mission to secure Syria's chemical weapons were undertaken, it would result in the control of some, but not all, chemical weapons in Syria. And that is not what is being discussed, because that would undoubtedly involve boots on the ground. According to the President, the purpose of his more narrow objective is to deliver a calculated message to convince Assad not to use his remaining chemical weapons and delivery systems ever again. But would such a strike be effective in preventing Assad from using these weapons again on a small scale after he has absorbed this strike, just to deliver his own message that he retains the capability to do so? Assad would retain a sufficient quantity of chemical weapons, and he knows that we did not respond to smaller chemical weapons attacks that he undertook before the August 21st, 2013 event. So on the one hand, the President is seeking to conduct a precision military strike that is sufficient to deter Assad from using any chemical weapons again. On the other hand, he wants to narrow the scope of a military strike so that Assad does not perceive this act of war as a threat to his regime. Yet the President has previously stated that U.S. policy is the removal of Assad, while administration officials have gone out of their way to state that the military strikes are only to deter and degrade Assad's chemical weapons use and are not intended to pick sides in the civil war, the text of the resolution before us is at odds with the administration's representations. The text states that it is the policy of the United States to, quote, change the momentum on the battlefield in Syria so as to create favorable conditions for a negotiated settlement that ends the conflict and leads to a democratic government in Syria. Well, Mr. President, no one could ever consider the Assad dictatorship to be a democratic government in Syria. Furthermore, on September 3rd, Secretary of State John Kerry testified that it is, quote, not insignificant that to deprive Assad of the capacity to use chemical weapons or to degrade the capacity actually deprives him of a lethal weapon in this ongoing civil war, and that has an impact. That's a very mixed message from this administration about the purpose of these strikes. Now, all of us want to see a peaceful Syria no longer led by Assad, nor controlled by the radical Islamic extremists that are part of his opposition. But is military action that could well get us involved in Syria's civil war the right answer? When I think about the proper response to Assad's abhorrent use of chemical weapons, I am mindful of the suffering and death that have occurred, as well as the international conventions banning chemical weapons. Since this is an international norm, however, where are our international partners? The United Nations, NATO, the Arab League? I have grave reservations about undertaking an act of war to enforce an international convention without the international support we have previously had when undertaking similar action in the past, such as in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and even Iraq. While NATO's Secretary General has expressed support for consequences, NATO's North Atlantic Council, which is the body that approves military action for NATO, has not approved this military action. The Arab League has condemned with words the use of chemical weapons, but there is yet to be any Arab League statement that explicitly endorses military action or promises to be engaged in that action. Even our ally, who has been most supportive, France, has asked for a delay to allow the UN inspectors to deliver their report next week. And let me add that I believe that report, early next week, will verify that it was the Assad regime that used sarin gas. That is my expectation. A military strike may well enforce the international norm with respect to chemical weapons, but at the same time, would it weaken the international norm of limiting military action to instances of self-defense or those cases where we have the support of the international community or at least our allies in NATO or the Arab League? In addressing this difficult and tragic crisis in Syria, the administration initially presented us with only two choices: take military action or make no response at all. I reject and have rejected from the start the notion that the United States has only two choices of undertaking an act of war or doing nothing in response to President Assad's attack on his citizens. There are a variety of non-military responses to consider that may well be more effective. The most promising of these options, proposed by the Russians, one of Assad's strongest allies, would place Syria's chemical weapons stockpile in the custody of the international community before they would ultimately be destroyed. Mr. President, I am not naive about trusting the Russians. My point is that this option may well be in Russia's own interests, would be more effective in securing the stockpile of chemical weapons in Syria, and would involve the international community. This diplomatic alternative would put Syria's chemical weapons under verified international control and would once and for all prevent Assad or anyone else in Syria from using those weapons. A risk of attacking Assad's facilities is that the chemical weapons could fall into the hands of terrorist elements in the country. That risk would be eliminated if the weapons were removed completely from Syria. One of the arguments advanced by proponents of the authorization for the use of military force resolution is that America's credibility is on the line. This is a legitimate concern. To be sure, it was unfortunate that the President drew a line in the sand without first having a well-vetted plan, consulting with Congress, and obtaining the necessary support for doing so. I would maintain, however, that the credibility of our great nation is beyond that of just one statement by the President, even in his important capacity as Commander-in-Chief. The credibility of the United States is backed by a military that is the most advanced and capable in the world. The strength of our military sends the clear, unmistakable message that the United States is capable of exerting overwhelming force whenever we decide that it is the right thing to do and it is necessary to do so. It would be a mistake for our adversaries to interpret a single vote regarding a military response to Syria's chemical weapons program as having ramifications for our willingness to use force when our country or our allies face direct, imminent threats, especially with regard to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities. At the very least, we have an obligation to pursue all non-military options that may well be more effective in preventing the future use of Assad's chemical weapons than the military option the President has proposed to undertake. For these reasons, should the authorization for the use of military force approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee come to the Senate floor, I shall cast my vote in opposition. My hope, however, is that the negotiations underway with the Russians will pave the way for the removal of chemical stockpiles from Syria and for their verified ultimate destruction. That is the best outcome for this crisis, and that would lead to a safer world. Thank you, Mr. President.